Hey everyone, and welcome to the final episode of Todos Santos. We've come a long way since I started this series more than 5 years ago now. The very first build, the castle, has mostly sat untouched for the whole course of the series, but some of the others, like the Old Town, the Downtown Interchange, we've done some significant remodels in an attempt to catch up the older parts of the city with the new ones, like some of the massive projects we've had, the port, and the smaller, more detail-focused ones like the Isle of Pigs. We've also had some weird builds in the middle there, like the film studio, and at least one that has made me disappear from the face of the earth for months at a time. Last episode, we started filling in the area around the airport with a fairly low-density district, and today we're going to finish it off with a district of high-rise condos, hotels, and no shortage of parking lots. Let's go. Today, I'm going to be taking inspiration mostly from the Isla Verde area, which is technically in the city of Carolina, although it is within the metropolitan area of San Juan. As you can see, there are lots of various high-rise condos, resorts, hotels, that kind of stuff, as well as a whole bunch of commercial buildings and beaches. So off camera, I went ahead and placed down the variety of assets that I would like to use here, trying to use as many of these sorts of rectangular, very deep buildings as I can, because I noticed that there are a lot of these in this location. There aren't actually too many of these on the workshop, so I just had to make do with what I have, and I'm just going to take these and arrange them. I'm not really going for the traditional tapered skyline that we have, for example, in the downtown, and that you see in lots of American downtowns. I wanted to go for a look where most of the prominent high rises are within a very narrow range of heights. I'm thinking this would probably be due to these places wanting to build up. So you're going to have some minimum floor in terms of height, but then maybe there's some height restriction within a certain distance from the airport, so they're not going to exceed a certain height. We do have this very tall tower right on the tip of the little peninsula here, which I think adds a nice little bit of definition, and it looks pretty cool in the cinematics, if I do say so myself. So I did want to have that. Maybe one little exception, it's just outside of the height restriction area, so they were able to build this nice tall condo. Moving over to tip of said peninsula, I wanted to have maybe the oldest building in the area here. Maybe there did used to be a small town right along the shoreline here that would have been connected to the sugar railroads leading into the industrial area. So I'm thinking this hotel here would have been around the center of this town. So you still have this old colonial style building right along the shoreline, which I think would be a nice attraction for tourists and maybe give some of the same vibes as the old town. But in a significantly different context, of course. It's attached to this public walkway along the old wharf. Maybe this used to be like a little fishing dock or something, but they've since established it as a public pedestrian area. One thing I've struggled with, I think, a lot through this series is overloading places with details, especially plazas like this. So I wanted to keep it really simple with just a small gravel planter in the center with some palm trees, a little dead end here for this street, which actually I'm really proud of with these curbs running along, and I think it looks nice and clean, especially once we fill in the surroundings as well. And of course, a little bit of lighting too. Another thing I wanted to improve on in this build is just being more mindful of the area around the bases of these buildings. For the majority of this build, especially with these high rises, that's going to consist of parking. And that's just really how it is with these kinds of buildings in this neighborhood, is that you'll often have either a small parking lot around the outside or just a small driveway that loops around the exterior of the building to access a built-in parking garage. In this case, there's a fairly large parking lot around the exterior. But in many cases, there are going to be garages built into the assets themselves, and I'm going to try to integrate all of these and give the cars enough space to get through, to park, to access the garages, that kind of thing. And that's going to serve to give these buildings a nice little bit of breathing room in between each other. In a previous build that I did like this, the buildings ended up being way too scrunched together, and it's not like an unrealistic way to build a city at all, but it's just not the kind of spacing and the kind of look that you get with this sort of development. So I'm just being more mindful of where the extent of these properties are, how they're fenced off, and how cars and pedestrians are going to access these buildings. And I think it's also going to let the assets shine a little bit more, because they often will have entrances, garages, unfinished sides like this building here and working around those instead of trying to hide them or just plain not paying attention to the way these assets are made. It's just going to make them feel like they were actually built up in this area for this area, as opposed to kind of being crammed in here awkwardly. Like it's so easy to do if you just put buildings down and don't really pay attention to the context, which I have definitely done a lot of, like I mentioned before. Sometimes it's as simple as just putting a few planters down or something like that, but then you get cases like this. I mean, this is such a central building to the look of this area. And I have to go in, I have to add an entrance next to the walkway and add a little loop around access road to get to the garage. Then there's this space in between, which I decided to just use as a surface parking lot. For a building this big, I figured it would be nice to have like a visitor's surface parking lot and then a parking garage for the residents. So this is probably going to be one of the most time-intensive condos to detail up. Last episode, I talked about how it was kind of daunting to do all these giant low-density neighborhoods over and over again and going into any sort of detail. But now that we're in the last build, I don't have that problem. I can just spend as much time as I want, and I did. It took me a long time to record this build. And it was honestly like so much fun to just have that weight off my shoulders of like, I don't have to do this a dozen more times to finish this city. It's like I'm just building. I just thought of it basically as its own unique series. I guess it's basically just a classic case of at least trying to go for quality over quantity. And despite that, we still have quite a few condos and hotels to get through. I'm going to cut out the boring ones and keep the more interesting ones. So we're going to move over one lot. We just have this little beachside house. I love the ones that have parking underneath it on the bottom floor, and then you have the living quarters above it. That's definitely something you see in this kind of context looking through Isla Verde, although there is still a giant surface parking lot next to it. We just have a lot of cars in this area. Another technique I'm trying to use is alternating between high rises and low rises, which I think also keeps it from looking too cramped of a build. On the other side of this building, we have a public parking lot. I wanted to give the public fairly easy access to the beach since we have all these private condos and hotels taking up the beachfront. So I'm just going to build a custom parking lot here, and then there's a little path running in between that and the nearby tower. It looks awkward to have these very right-angled plots of land sticking out into the beach at different lengths and different angles. So I'm trying to cover up any gaps in between the edges of the properties with some thick vegetation, basically to show that's where the transition from sand to normal soil takes place. And it feels a little bit more natural, I think, that way, to have these arcing curves of vegetation in between the buildings. One thing I noticed looking around Isla Verde is that you will find some of these low-density 1 to 2 story buildings pretty frequently in certain areas in between high rises. So even though they might be more of a suburban type of home, you will find them in this area. I don't know if those are just normal developments or if this area used to be like a low-density neighborhood that has mostly been redeveloped into these high rises. But either way, we have them here. This district isn't just for condos, though. We also have some hotels and resorts. We're going to have 2 main, very large resorts. They're both going to follow a similar layout. You have the business end in the front, with all the car access that you could desire for the hundreds of rental cars that are going to be coming in and out of this place every day. And then you're going to have the fun end on the other side of the resort, where you have the pool and lounge furniture and all that stuff that you would expect from a resort. This one in particular happens to have a parking garage down here to supplement the surface parking lot. Maybe the valet would take your car down here if you wanted them to, and park it down there if you didn't want to use this beautiful surface parking lot for some reason. Or this one. build the other fancier resort in just a minute, but before we get to that, I wanted to do a little bit more standard development. So we have this standalone hotel, not really a resort, next to this one. Next up, we're going to get started on the urban core of this neighborhood. This video is sponsored by City Skylines Unmoddable Internal Game Limits. Just in case the overwhelming amount of street parking and the surface lots aren't enough, I wanted to have a public parking garage as well. I'm going to turn the business end away from the main avenue to draw traffic off of there and to keep the traffic that's turning into the parking garage off of the main roads. And I think it also makes it a little less obtrusive, visually speaking, on the main avenue to just have this wall of concrete as opposed to this gaping hole in it. And then I'm just going to add these giant parking signs on top, fence it off, and add a few trees as well. And I think as far as parking garages go, this one looks, not horrendous. Like I mentioned before, I'm trying to alternate between shorter and taller buildings. We have this high-rise apartment next to the parking garage, but this additional entrance to the garage opens up into the parking lot, which doesn't look right. So I'm just going to cover that up with some concrete walls sized up with PO. I'm trying to keep the zoning fairly consistent, so on the main avenues you have either dedicated commercial buildings like this lovely theater, or high rises that we can at least imagine are mixed use with apartments on top and commercial on the bottom. And then as you move away from the main avenue, you're either going to have hotels, resorts, or in the less desirable areas, you're just going to have these small apartments. Just like all the other buildings, I'm trying to be just a little bit more mindful of the context and fitting in the footprint of the building more sensibly into the road network. And my thought at the time was that all of those factors working together would kind of just have all of these buildings and details fall into place from there, at least for these more generic blocks like this one, where I was just experimenting around with different things. Doesn't look that great overall, but it does the job to be just some background filler compared to some of the more interesting builds that we're going to do. Like right now, we're going to build the second resort, the really fancy, expensive, gigantic one. For this build, I'm going to be taking inspiration from the Ritz-Carlton San Juan, which has these very eye-catching blue roofs and a whole lot of trees and all these other interesting details. So I'm going to try to build something resembling that. To get those blue roofs, I'm gonna have to go into each of these buildings with PO and add a color overlay. I somehow managed to not record this, but basically I just went in and the same texture is shared in between all these assets, so I just had to do it once and then copy and paste these texture changes to each individual asset. The inspiration is in sort of almost an H shape with the bottom and top each surrounding a portion of the resort. So I'm going to try to go for that. We have this little arm over here on the right. Over on the left in just a second, we're going to add a parking garage for the bottom left leg of the H. And all of this surrounds the kind of entry driveway area, which we're going to landscape up in a minute. So I don't really have a parking garage asset that fits into this space. So I have to take this one out of a building, delete all the other nodes with PO, and just have the parking garage portion sitting here. Then of course that means it's not functional, so I'm gonna have to go in and manually detail it with some parking spaces and cars, which is kind of a pain. I cut out a whole lot of effort trying to get this to work, but eventually I got it to look like it's functional at least. I'm gonna try to make this area seem like it's the functional side of the resort, sort of the behind the scenes stuff. We're gonna block it off with some hedges and trees and stuff in a minute. But with that in mind, I decided to have the hotel shuttle originate from this parking garage. So I have an invisible bus depot that I'm clipping in there. I'm going to run a bus line over to the airport terminals and back here, and that's just going to shoot out these hotel shuttle vehicles. They also have a few additional ones stationed out here. I wanted to give this whole campus a different look from the rest of the neighborhood, so I'm using these grass blocks to block off large portions of empty space that we're of course going to add some trees and foliage and stuff to in a minute. And then all these sidewalks and various walkways I'm replacing with this stone slab texture. I thought it looked a little strange to not have an entrance roof here, so I'm just going to have to isolate this from another asset because this asset didn't have one built in, change the roof color just like before, and then it does unfortunately have this sign here that I don't want, so I have to, again, isolate this thing from the asset that I'm using. All of them are branded as Edge. I'm assuming this is a real-life place or something like that. So I have to isolate the Edge sign and make our own custom one up here. And following that, we really just need to put down a little bit of lighting, some fencing, and a whole bunch of trees. this side of the resort was pretty much the same as the first one, so I'm just going to show this little before and after. These are I believe they're called the Coral Beach Towers in Isla Verde, and I thought it was kind of cool that they had these more or less identical towers right next to each other, serving as a single condo complex. So I wanted to do something resembling that. I had a lot of trouble doing this parking lot and these underground parking garages as well. They kept flooding with water, and I kept draining them out with the vanilla water pumps, and it kept coming back. We also got tons of ambulances coming in and out of this place, which I assume those two things are related. But anyway, I detailed up the front with just this little turnaround and these two surface lots and the flooded parking garages. And detailed up the other side with pretty much the same sort of stuff we do for the hotels. Really, they're, at least from what I can tell, like looking at it from Google Earth, there's not too much of a difference between these condo complexes and the hotels. So I'm just trying to do little variations here and there, and I am including some sports facilities as well, like these custom tennis courts. But everything just seems to be a little bit more concentrated in the center here, and it's not as spread out because, of course, you're not serving as many people as frequently. If you have people at a resort, they're going to be there most of the time doing all their stuff out here. Of course, they're going to be outside if they're coming all the way to Todos Santos and paying hundreds of dollars to have a room on the beach. Whereas for the condos, it's going to be a little bit more infrequent because people, have jobs and they go out places in the city and that kind of stuff. So it's just a little bit more cozy and not quite intimate, but just it's at a smaller scale. But overall, I'm going for the same kind of look. Since all of the beaches are public access in Todos Santos, like I mentioned before, I'm just detailing up, not really even detailing, just plopping down a few of these functioning beaches and a few extra umbrellas here and there so it doesn't look like it's just been copied and pasted all over, even though it has been. Anyway, so we don't really have any public access points to the beach yet over on this side because we kind of have the two angles of beach. We already have a public parking lot and a public path over on the other side. I want to add one here as well along this corner of the road after just very quickly placing this condo down here and detailing it up. We have room for one more high-rise here. I really like this building, the kind of rounded facade here. I think just it stands out just that little extra bit compared to a lot of the buildings that we're using. And for some reason, I felt like being really precise with the details on this one, maybe because it's kind of like the last, or one of the last beachfront buildings that we're going to do, in not just in this episode, but obviously in the entire series. So yeah, I wanted to make it look nice, or at least authentic, if not nice. We have most of our high rises along the beach now, which I think is a nice look, but we have this giant empty space in the urban core of this neighborhood. So for this, I didn't want to just do the usual kind of lame commercial district that I've done so many of in this series. I wanted to really go in and take inspiration from the source. So I had Google Maps Street View open on one screen, and I had this game open on the other, and did a little bit of detailing. Basically using all the same techniques that I used for the high rises except scaled down for all these small commercial buildings. Also have this hotel that's kind of in the interior of this neighborhood. It's going to be probably a lot cheaper than the ones on the beach. So we have this maybe not so nice pool out back right in the middle of the parking lot. I've definitely been at hotels that are kind of like that. Not necessarily bad places to stay or anything, but not quite as luxurious as the high-rise ones on the beach, of course. There are a few other buildings of note in here as well. Another set of dual condos. These aren't quite as detailed, but I thought it was kind of a nice space to have last line of condos. And then we actually have one more condo along the beach here. There's a reserved area over to the side of this that we're going to do a special build in a minute. But I just needed to have something to buffer that from the big blue-roofed resort that we made before. Because of this giant parking lot that goes right up against the beach, we have, like I was talking about before, this awkward gap in between these two plots of land. So I'm just going to do the same technique with some of these shrub and grass assets to simulate the natural border between the beach and the soil. So we've made good progress filling this place in. And now to finish it off, there are 3 builds that I've been planning for quite a while. So we're going to get started on those right now. First are these condos. I'm not sure exactly what the name is, but I thought they were very interesting looking and a bit of a challenge to recreate. So I'm going to use this, I believe it's an office building asset. It's really the only building I could find that was the right shape and vaguely the right appearance. And I'm going to clip 4 of these together, one of them squeezed way down in the middle, into these condo blocks. So I'm going to take these fidget spinners and copy and paste them in a row until they fill up this entire area, which is basically the only space I had left at this sort of scale. So they have to go here, even though maybe it doesn't make sense having them right next to the runways. I think it actually does now that I think about it. Like this space right here, it's going to be really noisy with the planes landing. I mean, it's somewhat of a desirable area otherwise because you have pretty easy access to the beach and all these businesses along here. So maybe this place was undeveloped for a long time and eventually someone took a risk and built up these condos, thinking that they could attract a lot of tenants with maybe a slightly cheaper price because it's right next to the runway, while it's still I guess a fairly nice place to live, and it would at least be able to attract all the plane spotters in the city. The details in this are pretty sparse. It's really mostly just here for that really unusual look from the aerial perspective, but they do have a little path system that runs around here, a small patio with a pool and basketball court, and some fencing, and a whole lot of trees, of course. Now, because of the shape of the avenue here and the limitations of development by the airport, we have all these little weird angled areas to build in surrounding this fidget spinner development. So I just wanted to do a couple of condo developments, starting with one over here. I'm using these low-density houses. They're just meant to be single-family homes, I'm pretty sure, but I'm just using the same ones over and over again. And by doing that, they kind of look like a lot of the condo developments in San Juan. Again, the details are pretty light on this one. I didn't want to overdo it. I just wanted these to be identifiable when you look down at them from above as this cluster of homogeneous development compared to some of the things like this commercial strip. I didn't know what else to do in this curved area of the avenue, so I just decided to do some more commercial buildings. I just had to use PO a little bit to fit them into the curved shape of the road. Over here at the corner of this avenue, we have another condo development, again, using these Arcadian row houses that I used last episode. I just love these things, especially for this sort of build. And I'm doing the pretty typical sort of road network and just squeezing these buildings in as close together as I can. Once again, with this condo development, I'm just going for the aerial perspective for the most part. I hope it doesn't seem like I'm rushing through this. I mean, I sort of am, not doing as many details as I have for a lot of the other builds in this episode and in the previous episode. But I just didn't want to invest a huge amount of this video's time to these kinds of builds that we've already done in the series, because there are a couple more builds we have to do that I think are a lot more fun and are going to be a good way to wrap up the series. But first, I just need to detail up this gas station, which I thought it made sense to have on the corner of these two large avenues. And there's also this ugly strip of plain grass, which was bugging me. So I'm just going to add some dirt decals, make it look a little rough and undeveloped. And I thought this might be a nice little plane spotting area for our Sims. So you could pull off here, park, set up, and watch some planes. We have two builds left, and we're going to start with the one here along the beach. We're going to be taking inspiration from these guys, which are the Luquillo kiosks. Basically, what you see is what you get here. It's a long line of shops and restaurants with all kinds of different foods and drinks and other things available. I did visit here on my trip to Puerto Rico a long time ago. I don't really remember that much. But I do definitely remember the feeling of being there. So I'm going to try to get something that evokes that for me again. It has a long road down the front, and I'm going to use these parking lot roads, parking buildings, clipping them into the road. I'm using the angled parking version because that's what they have in the inspiration. And then I'm going to take all these buildings that more or less fit into this little rectangular space I have here and line them up. I'm basically taking anything that has the right type of storefront, and if they're not the right size, then I can just go in with PO and adjust them all to fit. I tried to go for a mixture of ones that basically just look like plain kiosks with a sign put up, and then some of them that look like a little bit more established restaurants, because I do remember there were like a couple of more kind of standard restaurants there as well among all the kiosks. So I'm really just going for an eclectic variety of buildings in that sense. I think it was pretty important to do that and then to adjust them with PO, because if I hadn't done that, then each building would have been a little bit too unique and it just kind of looks random, and it would end up being an ugly mishmash of buildings, which is not what I wanted. I wanted them to be more or less all the same depth and width with small variations, and then the important differences in between each building are going to come in the little details, both the ones baked into the assets and also the ones that we're going to add once I'm done adding these parking lines, because I didn't like the built-in parking lines. I wanted something a little bit more vivid. So once we're done with that, we're going to add more details any second now. I feel like a huge portion of this episode has been just detailing parking lots over and over again. Oh, I also had to make these functional with some commercial blocks. back end of this place was a little more difficult to detail because there's just not a lot of space to work with between it and the beach. So I struggled to figure out how to transition between the two areas. So what I ended up doing was just creating a small strip of grass in between the roads and the beach using some ploppable grass. And then I'm going to use some theme sand decals to cover up that ugly, blocky transition between the two, although we still, because the beach is a little lumpy compared to the ploppable grass, I'm just going to cover all of that up with a thick line of grass and shrubs. And of course, we need to add some trees as well. After stumbling across this extremely sunburned tourist and the twins that he has in tow, there's just one little last detail to add here, which is a beachside parking lot. Of course, there's street parking along this road as well, but I thought there would be maybe additional space. Here, just detailing it up with some rocks. And then I'm going to add a few details to the beach as well. And by details, I mean doing the exact same thing I've done for the rest of the beaches. So that's it for the kiosks, and we just have one more build to go to wrap up the series. So filling up this triangle, we have this lovely building, which is a replica of what used to be the Nassau Post Office in the Bahamas. I think the building's since been demolished. And I'm going to get to, in a minute, what this building actually functions as. But I wanted to be pretty meticulous with the details and make it look nice, because it is right here at the entrance, or one of the entrances to the city. So it has a grass planter base all the way around the exterior of the building, and then also directly along the roads as well. So you have a slightly set back sidewalk with these nice simple tile decals. I'm trying to form these planters around the road network a little bit. So you have this little parking bay in the center, and then it angles out when you get to the crosswalks to give the pedestrians a little bit of extra space. Then in this area behind the building, you have a small parking lot. It's really just there as a token. It's not meant to be a realistic sized parking lot for this size of building in this sort of area, but it's something to just give the building a little bit more breathing room. I wanted to make it more interesting than our usual parking lot, so there's a wheelchair access ramp. And because of the odd shape of the parking lot, the only spaces I could fit around the outside were these parallel parking spaces, which everybody loves, of course. The main feature of this whole campus is the large plaza over at this end of the building. There's a little pathway attached to the sidewalks so to provide easy access, and it has some nice planters in here. I didn't want the dirt texture that comes with these assets, but I really liked the worn texture of the exterior, so I'm just clipping some grass props into it to make up for that. I think this probably ends up being the best expression of what I was talking about before, with not overloading an area with details. I leave some negative space. Thinking of it as a plaza, you'd want space for people to be able to walk around or hang out and form groups in various areas without coming into conflict with all this stuff scattered around. So I'm just trying to keep it nice and clean and pleasant looking, if maybe a little bit corporate or concrete-y, I guess. But I still like how it looks overall. Especially once we get some foliage in, like bushes in these planters, and then some flowers in here in the main one, and of course some palm trees as well. Carrying that theme of sparseness through, I wanted to do the same thing with the lighting. Instead of having a bunch of lampposts scattered around, I'm adding these little like vent type lights into the sides of the planters and along the sides of the building as well. Now you might be wondering why I'm choosing this as the final build for the series, and it's not so much the building itself or the details of the surroundings, it's that I wanted something for this to adorn. And this is just a cute little sign provided by a friend of the channel, Bastet, who has been a huge support the whole time we've been in contact for quite a while now in navigating all the Latin American assets available on the workshop, and also actually commissioning a good number of them. So we have the Banco de Todos Santos right here at the entrance to the city. Well, there are many entrances to the city, but the northeastern entrance to the city, I guess. And this, I suppose, would be their main branch and their headquarters. So we have it plastered with this sign because I just think it's so cool to have this asset. And I'm also going to make a custom logo for them by isolating certain letters from the logo and placing them up here in some kind of weird combined BTS, Banco de Todos Santos, just visible up there to everyone driving along the avenue as they enter or leave the city. And as they do that, they're also going to see this area next to the plaza. So I wanted to have a nice entrance sign for the city. So everyone driving in on this small little highway into town will have a nice little welcome to Todos Santos, except for this guy. I thought of several different ways to do it, just like a plain road sign or maybe like a big fancy arch going over the road, but I ended up going for something kind of in between in terms of complexity. So we have a little planter with some pillars on either side, and in between those we have just a plain green sign, which I totally didn't forget to record me setting up in PO. And beneath this I'm going to take the Banco de Todos Santos logo that I just used, remove the Banco part, and just have Todos Santos and have that underneath. So we have these three-dimensional letters underneath, which I think is kind of an interesting contrast. And you kind of get the best of both worlds of the simplicity of the flat two-dimensional sign and the cool three-dimensional sign. These are held up by little green posts, which I think kind of blend into the foliage that we're going to add down there. And then I'm just going to add some very simple plants around the exterior just to emphasize the sign a little bit. As a symbol for the city, we're going to take this garita prop, shrink it way down, and initially I put it over to the side as if it was like on the side of the battlements of the castle or something, but it didn't really look right there. You couldn't really tell what it was supposed to be, so I decided to put it in the center in between the Todos and the Santos. Of course, anytime you have a two-way road, if you have an entrance sign, you're also going to need an exit sign. So we have pretty much the same sign, but of course with different wording, thanking visitors for coming to Todos Santos. I hope the wording is correct. I basically just took it from a sign I found in Mexico, so theoretically that should be correct. And surrounding all of this, we have, well, first a couple flags, some landscaping, and a nice fountain over here. And I'm going to surround both signs with these lovely red flowers, just to make everything feel a little bit more lush and welcoming as you enter or exit the city. Finally, there's a small access area here for this gardener who's just showing up to do some maintenance on all this landscaping. Before I go, I'd like to say a few thank yous. Thank you again to Bastet for providing so much help and so many of the lovely assets that have constantly revitalized my interest in this series. Thank you to Peter Barr for sharing a number of amazing Cuban and Puerto Rican assets. Thank you to Cities by Diana for giving me a shout out quite a while ago, which definitely helped boost the channel. And I mean, I don't make these videos for views or anything, but you know, all else being equal, I would always welcome more views. Thank you to Slyn for making our custom buses, ambulances, and police cars, which I just always love seeing driving around the city. And last but certainly not least, thanks to you for watching Todos Santos.
Just a little more. My mind is wide and aching. the core. Do we ever learn before it's too late? Why we keep falling, falling through aeons? Should I be leaning on each other all the way? Why we keep waiting, waiting for aeons, like time's been frozen, never too late. Ocean breeze blowing in your hair. Come to me. How do I come